Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tanya Verhulp, and I'm the Director of Executive Education here at the Haskayne School of Business. Thank you all for joining us today for the launch of our new online series, Haskayne Connects. Haskayne Connects was created to help you navigate through these uncertain times with quick tips and ideas to move forward. We will be hosting these sessions every Wednesday at noon on a variety of topics, so stay tuned for upcoming invitations. Please feel free to pass them along to anyone you think might be interested, and we hope you will continue to join us. A quick note that we ask that you hold your questions until the Q&A portion at the end. We have left a fair bit of time to take as many questions as we can. And with that, we're going to get started. So I'd like to introduce Beth Reimer-Hack, who will be moderating our session today.
Thank you, Tanya. It's a real privilege to be here to moderate the session today. And welcome
to all. Beth.
It's not showing up on me.
Oh, you're looking good. I can hear you.
Thank you. You can hear me? Okay, yeah. There we go. Sorry. So I think everybody else can hear me. All right, thanks so much, Tanya. I really appreciate being able to be here today and to be the moderator for this session today. And I'm really pleased and privileged that we have Dr. Fred Jacques, a renowned expert in his field, to be able to speak to us today on this really interesting topic, one that we can all relate to, which is how to tame the brain and lead in uncertain times. So welcome, Fred, and thank you.
Thank you, Beth. It's a real pleasure to be here with you.
That's great. So to start off, I know that all of us, whether we're in our business life or our home life or in our communities, are experiencing unprecedented uncertainty and change. And really, when we look at it, we have no clear timelines in terms of when that's going to go back to the new normal and what that new normal will look like. And so just on that point, just to kick it off, Fred, can you tell me, how do we as humans tend to process uncertainty?
Well, that's great, Beth. And I'm going to sneak in a little presentation that I hear some thoughts, if I may, that I think may be able to answer some of the questions. And there we go. Sorry, I'm just having a hard time getting the slideshow up here. Sorry.
No problem.
No, because there we go. Little toolbar is getting in my way. Nothing like a seamless beginning. Blame it all on me. Anyway, thank you. And the key thing, getting back to your question, is the brain does not like uncertainty. We are wired for certainty. We like to know what's going on. And it's almost sort of a primal instinct. And when we don't know what's going on, when there is uncertainty out there, what happens is the brain tends to process that as a threat. And what we want to do is, when there is uncertainty there, the brain sees that as a gap, and we want to close that gap. So all of our neural energy will be directed to try to closing that gap. Those neurons want to bridge that synapse, and our attention is going to be taken away from other things that we could be working on, other things where we need to pay attention and to place some focus, because the brain is putting all of its energy into trying to close that gap and to sort of create certainty where that uncertainty exists. So it drains a lot of neural energy away from other things that we could be using to be productive and effective.
Well, that's really interesting, because I know for sure that for me, I find that when I'm having something that is new or changing, that I have a certain kind of emotional response where I'm not comfortable with that uncertainty. Yeah. So, and I know when COVID hit, a lot of us had shock and awe. And can you tell us, Fred, just from that, is there something within us that would explain that response? Is there a certain way that the brain works to respond to uncertainty?
Well, I mean, if you think of everything you just described, Beth, it's really a period of unprecedented uncertainty, from business to business, from province to province, country to country. Things keep changing. We get different advice, and we're not quite sure where to pay attention to and what the quote unquote right answer is. And in the face of that uncertainty, the brain processes it as a threat. And when we have a threat reaction in our limbic system, what happens is it elicits a stress response. When we get into a fairly typical stress response, what happens is our stress hormones get released, and that's both adrenaline and cortisol. And what each of these will do is it will tend to increase our blood pressure. It narrows our focus, and a lot of that neural energy that we were talking about become very concentrated and very focused on resolving the situation which is creating the stress. So we're looking for a quick solution, not necessarily the best solution. So we're not really operating at our optimum. And that's why that uncertainty, trying to close that gap, it's a threat, and the typical threat response is exactly what you see here. It's stress, and the stress hormones really start to narrow our focus in terms of what we're paying attention to.
So there seems to be that, so it seems that the stress response, the way it affects our brain, is that it's not optimal, really, is what we're talking about. And so because it's not optimal, how does that affect our decision as leaders?
Okay, that's a great question as well. And ironically, we're talking about decision making and thinking, but I want to bring in emotional intelligence here. And this little circle model that you see is the bar on EQI. It's one of the more influential models of emotional intelligence. And you see there's 5 broad areas of emotional functioning, 15 competencies, but the emotions influence our thinking influences our emotions. It's always a balance between the rational and the affective, the thinking and the feeling. And it's the interplay of those emotions, because it's when we get that limbic system moving, that's when the fight or flight, the stress response comes in. We can become flooded with emotions, and what happens, we have that stress response that we talked about. So if our stress tolerance isn't working terribly well, where it can impact across this model is in things like impulse control. We tend to become more impulsive. We don't think through the consequences of our actions. Reality testing, we're not as realistic in assessing a situation as to what the real threats or opportunities might be. As I said, when it comes to problem solving, we're going to rush to the easiest and most immediate solution, not necessarily the best, and especially in times of uncertainty. And think about how each of us has had to change our lifestyle, our work style, our way of living day to day. A good adaptive response to that uncertainty would be flexibility, but when we're stressed, our flexibility is reduced. Our ability to pivot and to change quickly in response to those unexpected circumstances is severely restricted. And so what happens, we become so focused on us, and especially as leaders, the risk is we start paying less attention to the folks around us. Now, the more I read about leadership these days, in particular in these times, one of the key things for leaders is to have empathy and a little patience for what other people are experiencing. And when we start realizing how focused we're getting and how we're not paying attention to other people, ironically, we start feeling worse about ourselves. And that just complicates this whole cycle. Study done in the States by Dr. Dick Thompson put individuals under circumstances where they were placed in making decisions and then placed under stress and making the decisions again. And he found across the board that all the competencies that we see here were reduced across the board by 15% in terms of effectiveness for leaders. So that's a pretty significant impact. It does certainly impact our decision making, and from a bunch of different perspectives.
So that's very interesting to see how effective we are then when we're under stress, and all these different things that happen within us in terms of our understanding of how it impacts our decisions. So what kinds of things do you say that we can do to address this?
Well, I mean, this image will be becoming quickly unfamiliar to people, because there's not too many of us that have been on planes recently. I'm suspecting everybody on the call has been on a plane at a point in time. The minute you're in your seat and you buckle in, they close the door. You see, in the unlikely event of an emergency, if you are traveling with someone else, always don your own mask first. And that is crucial advice for a leader. A lot of self-serving leaders, especially in times of uncertainty, will put others ahead of themselves. But if we want to be at maximal effectiveness, both for ourselves and for others, the first thing I would suggest that leaders should do is to look after themselves. And I know that sometimes when you say that, it can sound selfish, but self-care at any time, but self-care particularly now, is not selfish, it is strategic. Because if you're not looking after yourself, you're not going to be at your optimal. You're not going to be setting a good example for the people around you, the people with whom you typically work and interact. If you're tired, if you're stressed yourself, it's going to be hard to have the resilience necessary, I would suggest, to support others during these times. So self-care is not selfish, it is strategic. Think about what you need to do to look after yourself so that you can be best positioned to look after others. The basic things like, eating well, sleeping well, staying in a regular routine, especially during these unsettled times and working at home. But I think the crucial thing, the starting point, leadership begins with me, and the best thing I can do to be an effective leader right now to start is to take care of myself.
Well, that seems to make sense to me, Fred. And I'm wondering around, you know, I know it's sometimes it's a tough message for us as leaders to be able to take on and say, because your automatic reaction is to be able to say that you want to take care of everybody else, and then you put yourself last, and you're saying exactly the opposite. Which with that that slide that shows giving yourself, like the airplane, the oxygen first, really does make sense. So would you have some suggestions then to be more effective as a leader, how exactly we would take care of ourselves here?
No, I think, again, I think that's the starting point. That's the intention. And there's a lot of different ways to do it. And, you know, listen to the basic advice, especially people working from home for the first time, to make sure you're eating well, sleeping well, pardon me, that you have a regular exercise routine, and you try not to get choked up when you speak up on a webinar. That would be helpful too. Excuse me. And but in addition to that, something that has really come into the mainstream, it's a practice that's been around for a very long time. But the notion of what we can do to enhance self-care is mindfulness. And there's a lot of things that can be caught up or demonstrated in the definition of mindfulness. And just out of curiosity, there's an example of 7 different things here that we can do in order to be able to better demonstrate and integrate mindfulness into our daily practice as a leader.
Maybe at this point, you know, looking at this list here, I would call them kind of tools in the toolbox of mindfulness. Mm-hmm. It would be good to be able to get a poll done from our audience about how many of these they do. And that would give us an idea of how many, or, you know, make a comment about if in fact a lot of us are doing that as leaders.
Okay, no, I think that's great. I think, you know, we had a very Zen moment here, because when the question was ready, the poll appeared. So it's great. It's great to watch this. And I think one of the things that you can see sort of to the just a little bit to the left of the screen as people are sort of compiling their answers here, and please do answer anywhere from 0 and upwards, is one of the things that's accessible to all of us. And ironically, as we wait for the poll to compile, we can actually do a demonstration, if you like, of mindfulness right now. And this is one of the techniques that's accessible to all of us. So this is a serious invitation to all, apparently 119 of us on the call, is as the poll is compiling, just take a minute and literally take 3 deep breaths. I mean, this is a serious invitation right now. And nobody's watching you while you do this, but if you take 3 deep breaths and just notice the impact that it has on you. So I'm going to do that right now.
Perfect. What a great way of, you felt it right away in terms of making yourself feel less stressful, you're more clear. And are we done? How do we have, is everybody done?
Yeah, well, we've got, you notice, like you said, Beth, that you can feel that sense of relaxation. It also allows you to focus for those 15, 20, 30, 60 seconds. Now, if you look, the question that we asked is which of any of these 7 practices, without identifying them, which is great. But I'm impressed by the numbers, because if you look at the bars, we've got, you know, 24% of people online who are practicing at least 3 of these, 20% at least 4, and 24% at least 5 of them. And I think that's amazing. And that shows, I would hope that for the folks that are online today, it's in part to hopefully learn a little more, but also to reaffirm that some of the things that they're currently doing make sense in terms of, as a leader, as an individual leader, doing what we can to look after ourselves and to practice the things that can make us effective as a leader. So well, that's great, because I think that's a reasonably high percentage of people practicing multiple things. And for each one of us, it could be something different. But across the board here, meditation, breathing is accessible to all of us, doing what we can right in that middle for stress reduction. Anything helps.
So would you have, knowing that, seeing this poll and we can all do better, would you have any other suggestions on how to implement a kind of mindfulness practice?
Yeah, there's a lot of advice out there. I found a really interesting study recently that came up with a number of mindfulness practices, and there's no rocket science here, but there's ancient wisdom here. I like this one though. Start your day in the way that you would want it to unfold. And this particular practice actually came from a number of peer-reviewed medical studies I'd mentioned some of the stress hormones earlier on. This one peer-reviewed study indicated in the first 30 minutes after we wake up, the level of cortisol, which is one of our stress hormones, increases by 75%. Irrespective of age, gender, health status, in the first 30 minutes that we're up, our stress hormone goes up 75%. Kind of in anticipation of what kind of stresses we're going to have during the day. What they found is if you sort of set the alarm even a couple of minutes early, leave your head on the pillow, and for 2 to 5 minutes, simply focus on in breathing, what kind of day you want to have, what kind of successes you're hoping to have, to frame the day in a positive way can actually reduce that level of cortisol and increase the likelihood that we will actually experience the kind of day that we're hoping to experience. So 2 to 5 minutes before kind of feet hitting the floor to take the day on. Uncluttering the workspace both physically and mentally. I know some people work well and feel at home and kind of a cluttered desk, but they're talking about the physical workspace, but also the processes that we use and where we can simplify things and just have simple processes that we can follow so they get things done in an orderly fashion, don't take too much additional mental energy. One that for, I think, 119 people online, there will be 119 challenges here, letting go of the phone. They suggest even once a week, taking a 1-hour lunch hour without your phone and just getting away from it and not worrying about the texts and email messages that you're missing. Taking 5 in the quiet, we just demonstrated. Taking 5 minutes in the quiet if you can. Taking those deep breaths at regular times during the day. Taking 5 is an expression. It doesn't have to mean 5 minutes. But I always ask this question, and it's not from a GPS perspective. But where am I right now? What am I feeling? Am I stressed, mad, happy, sad, glad, whatever it might be? If I can focus in on that, become aware of that, I can be more intentional about what I do and I can manage the stress. And this last one, which they had as literally a bonus tip, was tend to a plant. Connection with nature has been shown to increase well-being. If we can't get out of the office or our home workspace right now, they literally said if you have a plant and needing to take a little bit of time every day to tend and water and pay a little bit of attention to the plant, and this is not a facetious suggestion, it'll have the same beneficial effect as if you're able to pet your dog or cat. That sense of calm that it brings, and having to take a few minutes out of our day to pay attention to someone else, even if it's a plant, actually brings benefit. And this was, I found these to be very interesting recommendations. Anybody can tackle them.
That's all very practical advice. I think I find the hardest one to do is to let go of the phone right now, because as we're all very interested in what's going on in our world and we're caught up in social media. So all those tips would be great and simple things to do to be able to affect your decision making as a leader. So we've talked quite a bit about how as an individual that we can make better decisions and lead through these uncertain times. Do you have some suggestions, especially for all of us as a leader, because we all have teams, we're all supporting people, on what we can do to support our teams through this, through the uncertain times?
I think it's an important thing. Like you said, we've been focusing on this as individual leaders and what we can do, not to lose sight of the fact that we do have a team literally out there now virtually. And oftentimes now, if you ask people what's changing, people will say everything. It feels like no part of life is certain, no part of life is settled, our work isn't settled, our personal life, future of the economy, all these things seem completely unsettled. You ask people what is changing, everything. Study from McKinsey indicated that really in most changes, there are 4 levels of change. We're definitely not at level 1 right now where there's a single clear enough future, nor is it likely that we're really at level 4 in true and complete uncertainty where we don't know what's going to happen next. We may not know when the province will reopen. We may not know when the businesses will reopen. We may not know when we can socially get closer together again, but we will at some point in time. So it's not a question of if, but when. In reality, we're typically between levels 2 and 3. Where there's a certain number of alternate futures that are possible out there. And right now, to help the members of our team and ourselves, is if we don't exactly know where we're going, take a step back and look at how we got to where we are right now. What are our strengths? What are our core competencies? How and where have we succeeded in the past? How as teams or organizations have we faced adversity, dealt with the adversity, come through it, often stronger and better? Get people grounded in what they do know and less focused on what they don't know, because as we move forward, that kind of confidence, that ingenuity, that ability to draw on past experience is actually going to help people to successful moving forward. But everything seems so unsettled right now. We lose sight of that. So we do know more than we think we know. And the more we can get our team connected with what we do know and to draw on the wisdom and experience, I think it helps to settle things down and move us down from that belief that we're at level 4. We're oscillating somewhere between level 2 and level 3 right now. that would be my first thought, kind of framing things for them.
So we know what we know,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's what you're saying. So how can we use that to prepare to succeed in the eventualities that we're likely to encounter as we go forward here?
Well, you know, we're back to almost the beginning of the conversation about looking at sort of threat and reward, and what elicits a threat response, and then how do we have a stress response to that. There's a model I like going to quite frequently. I'll go with very briefly here. It's the SCARF model that was developed by Dr. David Rock at the Neuro Leadership Institute, and a way of, again, building on what we know about the basic instincts in the brain and how we respond to both reward and threat. We tend to move towards reward and away from threat, and that's where the stress response actually enables us to do that. I won't be able to go through all of these, but we've already talked a little bit about certainty. And just as we were saying with that model from McKinsey, is help people to remember exactly what they do know, where their strengths are, what their capacities are, and that there's a greater sense of certainty in what we do know, and it helps us to manage what we may not yet be aware of. The other thing, as with so many people working independently and autonomously now, sometimes for the first time, is what can we do actually to enhance that autonomy? When people feel like they're being micromanaged, like these folks in the image, they feel very constrained. That's another threat, and we have that same kind of stress response. If we set people up for success as they're working autonomously, if we demonstrate trust, if we give them as much latitude and flexibility as we can to get things done, so we focus more on outcomes than on activities, that builds a sense of confidence, and people feel more empowered if they have a sense of autonomy and they can make decisions for themselves. They're going to be out there anyway, so give them the support and the belief that they will be able to achieve what is required. And another thing is relatedness, ironically, is we're all socially distancing, but we all need to stay connected. This is from a mental health perspective. This is from a general business perspective. When people feel isolated, when they feel alone, they start to believe they're the only people who are feeling way or thinking this way, and it's counterproductive. So keep people connected. I know everybody's been zooming the daylights out of things, but keep people connected so that they know that they're not alone. Where relatedness comes in is people feel safer and more productive when they feel part of a community, where they're welcome, where they're safe, where they can openly express their opinion, when they have the support of others. So even at a distance, help people to reduce that isolation. Just a very quick example, working with one organization right now, and I know not everybody has the budget for this, so forgive me for the example, but once a week, this leader gets all of his team on the phone, on a Zoom at lunch hour, and they play bingo. And he allows them to Uber Eats a lunch into home for them to eat for up to $25 per person, so they can play bingo and eat lunch on the company once a week. And I know not everybody has the budget for that, but I think it's a great way of keeping people connected and communicating outside of just talking about business. It maintains relationships. But anyway, maybe a bad example, but one that I see in use right now. But those would be the things I would think of.
That's great. So I think we're that's the end of the presentation. And thank you, Fred.
Pleasure.
All very thoughtful and very practical. I'm wondering if we have some time for questions right now. And what we would like to be able to do is, if you have a question, if you could just please raise your hand via the participants menu. And Tanya, are you going to call upon people? Yes. Okay. I was just checking because it said that the moderator, which I wanted to make sure I got this right. So Tanya is going to be the one who's going to assist us here. So if you could just identify yourself to her by putting your hand up on the participants menu, and then what we'll do is have you just say you unmute your phone, say your name, ask the question. If you could please keep it brief so that we're able to take as many questions as possible, we would greatly appreciate that. And then after you're finished saying the question, just make sure you mute your line again. That would be super. So while we're waiting for people to identify themselves, Fred, I'm wondering if you can answer a question for me, and it's about that SCARF model, you know, that one. Thanks, Patrick. Where it's, and I'm wondering if there's one of these aspects that you would say is more of this model that is more predominant. Is there one part of that model that's more predominant that is important?
Well, I'm sorry. I think the certainty one that we talked about is the whole basis of our conversation today. And we looked at autonomy and relatedness. I wanted to sneak in a couple of comments on the other two, and status. Anything that would tend to undermine or diminish our status would be perceived as a threat. Anything that elevates status. One of the things I'm finding in working with leaders is for some of them, and it's not in any kind of a negative sort of way, or they feel like they've lost status a little bit because they're not visible to their team at all times. They're not there. People are making decisions on their own. It's a bit of an adjustment for folks. And also when people are distributed more evenly in a virtual environment, the kind of pecking order that shows up in meetings when we're around an actual physical table is different. So some people are adjusting to that and finding it difficult. And the one that seems to be global, since I want to get each element of this model kind of on the table very briefly, is fairness. Growing up, I remember hearing the expression all the time, hey, get used to it, life's not fair. And how many people feel that way right now because of the uncertainty, because of the impact on employment, on finances? People, that were just starting a business or about to start a new job or had big plans for vacation, all crumbled fairly quickly, and we have very little control over that. And we like to have control. So people are feeling a little, it's an old expression, a little hard done by. So, but it's being mindful of these things, not overreacting if people seem to be impacting, and trying to be, the empathy piece comes in again. Understand things from the other person's perspective and try to put it in perspective for them. Life isn't fair, but we're still here, hopefully all breathing. We'll move on and we'll find good things to do. And as far as status, maybe it's an interesting thing to think about. Maybe I don't have to be the in-charge type of leader because my team is out there working virtually. I'm not sitting with them 8 hours a day and look at this, the work is getting done. This could be a new day for everybody. So those are a couple of thoughts that come to mind.
Well, thanks. Jenny, do we have any questions?
I do have one that came in through the chat, which is, from your perspective, what are the best questions to ask your teams to open up the well-being conversation?
Well, and I see that Dan's raised his hand as well. It's going to sound kind of trite, but if it's the well-being conversation, the typical thing that comes to mind is what we typically go, how's everybody doing, right? But I think that's going to elicit the usual response, fine. If you've got folks that are on, online and Zooming in for the first time and going around table, I like always to try to keep a balanced approach to things. What's the biggest challenge you've been facing for the last week or 2 weeks, assuming that's the interval between the meeting? What's the biggest change that you've noticed? Or what's the best part of working from home? And sometimes if people feel defensive about that, you could preface it, I always try to use humor by saying, I know you miss us and I know you love being with us 8 hours a day, 5 days a week typically, and we're not there, but what's the best thing about working from home? And all or some combination of those, I think, is a way of kind of doing the well-being. And then I'm not trying to take the well-being issue lightly either, is try to also be, pun intended, mindful. And if you know your team well, if you know folks well, and this could be peer-to-peer, and despite the fact it's a virtual environment as opposed to a physical environment, if you get the sense that somebody is really, if I can use the phrase, off their game or reticent, and even in Zoom, you can sometimes pick up on signals that something seems to be a little off, I would encourage, with discretion, following up with that person on an individual basis and reaching out just to make sure that they are, quote unquote, doing okay, offering support. People are reluctant sometimes to admit that they might be struggling, but so I don't know if there was any coherence in the various suggestions that I had there, but how are things going? Fine. About what's new, what's difficult, what's been the most fun about being home, and then if you get that sense that somebody might be struggling, to follow up on an individual basis.
Great, thanks, Fred. Dan, why don't you go ahead and ask your question? Unmute yourself and go ahead.
Perfect, thank you very much. Sorry about that, I might have raised my hand, Fred, a couple times. But
sorry, Dan.
No, that's okay. Hey, I just wanted to ask you a question, or maybe get your advice or opinion on, with the times that we're in right now, as far as us as leaders, how do we balance our on the dance floor versus up in the balcony? Thought you'd get a kick out of this one. Being in the trenches or being on the dance floor with our team versus, taking a step back and being up on the balcony. Has it changed your philosophy or your thinking with what's going on? Or if you could just comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
No, great. If you're open to a little stream of consciousness here, that's kind of where my thinking is. And for anybody who isn't familiar with with that framework, and I kind of did double thumbs up, is a Harvard Business Review article from 1990 that I keep, if I may use the term, milking for benefit. And it's a need for a leader to spend a balanced amount of time between being on the dance floor and dealing with the day-to-day struggles and getting on the balcony and getting some perspective. And Dan, it's a really interesting one, because I think based on what I've seen and heard, it varies from person to person. I think what's happened in the first few weeks, and now it's many weeks ago, that people began the transition to working virtually, the whole focus was on the dance floor, because we got to get people set up, we got to get people IT, you know, connected, we got to get the hardware. They're dealing with, okay, I've got kids and at home from school, and I've got animals that are running around, and a lot of it was just getting things up and running and finding out what the new normal was to sustain business moving forward. So of necessity, I think a lot of the focus has been on the dance floor. I think the balcony is a little bit about what we're talking about today, is how do I take a step back and assess both where I am and where the team is. The thing about the balcony analogy is that typically what we say is the leader needs to take a bit of a broader and longer term perspective, but the view from the balcony is pretty cloudy right now. And, you know, like literally, if we were on a balcony in any one of the 10 provinces or territories, 3 territories, we'd probably be seeing a different perspective right now, let alone south of the border. But I think, you know, it's taking a little bit more time on the balcony now to think about, okay, we've settled into a routine with people working virtually. Is the work getting done? Have I been able to shift from what I would call an activity metric to an outcomes metric? What I mean by that is I can't look out my door to see people working. That's an activity metric. Is the work getting done? That's an outcomes metric. You know, I can't see what they're doing. I don't know the hours they're working, but you know what? We're meeting targets. Things are getting done. I think it's a little bit more balcony time now. I'm iterating towards a response here. I'm stepping back and saying, okay, people are getting the work done. And is it sustainable? What's it going to look like? Do they need any additional supports from me, including the outreach we've been talking about this morning? And thinking about the eventuality of when we go back, what's it going to look like? How has my role changed over time? How has the way we do work changed over time? And it's not waiting until somebody waves a green flag and said, let's go. It's really thinking about when things do get back to whatever new normal is going to be. How am I going to adapt to that? How is my team going to adapt to that? I know already some organizations are thinking about, I was going to use the word struggling, with the anticipation that there's going to be increased interest, if not pressure, from a certain percentage of employees to say, hey, I worked at home for 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months, why can't I continue to do that? And does the work style and does the culture of the organization easily enable that? So I think if I'm trying to pull a thread through my rambled response here, we've been spending probably a lot of time on the balcony. I think as a leader, it's taking a bit of a step back and saying, what do I need to do now to support folks? And how do I think about, as the clock starts to tick down, how are we going to get back to whatever new normal is? And I think that's balcony time. Did that even approach a coherent answer, Dan?
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
So we have Alex next. Go ahead, Alex, unmute yourself.
Thanks, Fred. Yeah, good presentation so far. The point I wanted to talk about was autonomy.
Yep.
So I find for my group, the autonomy was actually greater when we were in the office. So you're talking about activity-based versus results-based. I'm finding that the results-based is actually falling off at home. So I'm starting to have to, you know, have less autonomy for these guys, and they're actually even asking me, you know, can you give us deadlines on things where I never used to have to before? So I got kind of talk to that if you want.
No, thank you. You know, and it's really important that you brought that up because the thing is even with autonomy, and I'm sorry, I've got this up and I should have put it back to the questions, but I'll leave it since it's here. Autonomy, yes. And if we go back up to this image, people don't feeling like they're being stage managed. And the way I think about autonomy is think about, you know, being wrapped up and constrained. We physically try to break from that. What I didn't say, and what your question is really bringing up is important, is autonomy within boundaries. Now, ironically, when I put this image in, if you can see it on your screen, it's got a frame around it. And I think what you're bringing up is the importance of boundaries and having autonomy within those boundaries. And, you know, if the boundaries were kind of implicit before and not, you know, explicitly enforced, if I can use that word, when you're in the office, people kind of knew, and there's a mutual accountability, and we can see each other, and we're in meetings, and if somebody's supposed to deliver on something, and you can see by the way they're sitting at the table that they didn't quite get there, that discomfort is more likely to give them an incentive to be on time next time. out there, and I'm drawing pictures here, nobody can see, I'm drawing a big square out there, the big square is now I'm working from home. And yeah, there's deadlines, but there's also a lot of other distractions going on, which is why all the new internet memes and all that, the fun that people have when someone's in the middle of a Zoom call and their children walk in or the dog, jumps up on the desk. I think what you're illustrating is the importance that the world has changed. It isn't as disciplined. And if you're seeing that, the productivity, the outcomes-based measures are going down, then it's not about restricting autonomy, it's about structuring it. And it may be working with individuals on the team who might be having a hard time structuring themselves because otherwise they had to get on transit and be in the office at 8:30 and the Outlook was telling them when to go to a meeting. It might be a roundtable discussion, a variant on that question about what would I ask a team, from the well-being question. It might be a roundtable. So who's really struggling, or something that sounds a bit less judgmental. So any challenges working from home, and let's talk about what's my biggest challenge working from home. And if people can share that, then maybe they can share ideas with each other, and or you can pick up on hints, where especially if the team is saying, Alex, give us more because we're not quite sure what to do. Maybe you could set up, help them to set up regular schedules and work, because that's one of the big recommendations right now is to keep people sane when they're working from home, is get up at a regular time, you get dressed, not necessarily as you would to go to work per se, but eat your breakfast at a regular time and do what you have to do to help the kids with school and things like that and walk the dog, but then make sure there's a block of time that is yours and yours alone to do the work. And there's a lot of distractions that can pull that away, but it may be working with individuals on the team and the team, peer suggestions, as well as things that you could bring up to bring a little structure and put some boundaries around the autonomy. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, that's really good. Just want to touch a little further on that is, the leadership style of being a leader rather than a boss. So that's very tough to enforce when they can't see what you're doing either. So it's very tough to show the amount that I'm accomplishing when I'm at home, when nobody sees it, right?
Right, but the interesting thing is that if you're having regular Zoom meetings or some other platform, is to find a way without saying, hey guys, look at me, look at how productive I am, twice as work, is to be able to share what you've been able to accomplish at home and what's enabled you to do that. So for instance, here guys, here's how I've been doing to organize my day, and then typically it would take me so long to do this. We have this monthly report, whatever it might be, because I've been able to focus and not have to go to meetings, not have to answer phone calls. I've actually got that done in half the time I typically would. And to set it up as more of not, hey, look at me, I'm great, but here's a suggestion that worked for me. Would that help anybody else? That, I think it achieves two outcomes. It lets them know that you're not sitting at home watching TV, and at the same time that you've adapted ways that can help you to be more productive.
Great, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Alex. Tanya?
Great. So we have Kathy next. Go ahead, Kathy.
You somewhat, thank you, and I thought this was great. I really appreciate it. You somewhat answered this question, but I'm just curious that when we start to come out of this, we've referred to the new normal, etc. Are there any aspects of your presentation that would require different focus as we're coming out of this versus when we went into it and having to sustain our isolation and that sort of thing? So is there something we can proactively do as leaders for our team before we start getting out of this isolation?
It's a really great question, Kathy, and I know I apologize. I keep leaving this slide up with the SCARF model rather than going to the question slide, but it seems to be working. I think one of the things is if a timeline starts to evolve where, in the nature of the work that the organization's doing and when the health authorities are saying, we can start to move back or, on a graduated schedule, that's where we get back to certainty and a little bit of structure and a little bit involvement with the team of thinking about, how do we phase? Let's make an assumption, it's only one scenario, a phased return of everybody 100% going back to work, to a physical co-location. Working with the team to think about who would go back first and what would the requirements look like, and how can we keep sort of a continuity in business, because we're not going to 100% of us show up that first morning. It's probably going to be a phased return because we may have to continue social distancing in the workplace for a while. I even heard scenarios this week where if kids go back to school, half the class will go in the morning and half the class will go in the afternoon, so there can be social distance between the kids. Same thing at work. So get them involved early in thinking about what's the schedule going to look like? Who's going to be doing that? And get some input from that. The input from that can also then stimulate a little bit more of that autonomy. But this is also to be very mindful, with no pun intended, of where do you think your challenges are going to be for people, you know, on an individual basis, transitioning from work at home to work back in the office. You know, for some people who, you know, can't wait to get back into a structured physical setting, no issue. For other people have found that, hey, this kind of fits me a little bit more, and will that be possible for that individual moving forward? So a little bit of flexibility there. So thinking about a plan, planning ahead, anticipating questions that may come up about how much autonomy will I have moving forward? Can I continue to work at home on a full or graduated basis? And I think it's once, you know, this, I'm kind of going off, it's not just the SCARF model that's guiding me, or I'm looking off in a different direction. It's also just anticipating how people are going to say, so what's the new normal? And I won't have all the answers. And I think as a leader, that's what I've always said. Is I don't know a leader that works with perfect information. And I can't think of any leader at any level, from the leaders of countries to the leaders of teams, that are going to go back into a workplace with certainty. And my suggestion, which you can discard, would be a little bit of authenticity, with a little bit of vulnerability thrown in to say, you know, guys, this is a whole new world for all of us, me included. I won't have all the answers. I won't be sure. I'll try to be as open as I possibly can. I'll share information as it comes in, but let's be open and flexible about things. No one will have the answers, including me. So not to set high expectations that that certainty is going to go back up to 100%. It's just, it's paving the road for a more flexible and less certain environment as we go back. Did that help at all, Kathy?
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great.
How are we doing, Tanya?
I do have another question that came in ahead of time, actually, through registration.
Okay.
So with so much information and, you know, impossible to verify it all, how do you provide confident leadership that has direction and vision?
Wow. Easy question, no. Really interesting point. In the era of what some people consider to be fake news, and I won't go there, you know, the plethora of information that's out there. One of the reasons for having this webinar series from Haskayne is to try to offer some perspectives, to give people some frameworks and anchors to think things through. You know, and trying to give you a coherent response to that as a leader and wanting to base on good information. It's almost like going back to who do you listen to right now in terms of the health authorities. I know the health authorities have come under criticism. I'm not talking from a medical perspective, using it as an analog. These are the folks who are the experts. These are the folks who should be in a position, hopefully, of giving us good guidance on what to do. So if you take that model and put it back into the business world, what kind of business are you in? What are the financial implications of what you're doing? What was the culture of the organization like before this all hit? And we're into sort of this virtual world. What kind of adaptations do you need to make? What are the new best practices that are emerging? It's a roundabout way of saying, where do you look for input? Well, who are the trusted experts that you went to before for financial advice, for planning advice? Try to, you know, to look for those sources that have been reliable in the past. Look at the messages that they're providing now. Do they seem to have understood and adapted to these changes? And which of those can we take as good sort of bellwether indicators as to how we should be moving forward as an organization? Because I think there's going to be a lot of instant experts that show up on the scene with a lot of different ideas on how to structure businesses and to move things forward. We can't go back to the tried and true because we don't even know what that is anymore. But if you look at the nature of the business that you're in and where you've gone for trusted advisors before and what sources of information and best practices you've typically accessed in the past, I would start there first. And then also to put a supportive but critical eye on the advice that you get from that to see if they seem to have been able to understand and to adapt to the change in circumstances. So I hope that whoever the question came from may have responded appropriately to that. Perfect.
Thank you, Fred. That was, and thank you, Tanya, for leading our Q&A there. Those were really great questions, and we've had a wonderful discussion. Before we say our thank yous, I'm wondering, Fred, if you can give us our key takeaways from our session this morning.
No, thank you, Beth. And of course, these are biased because they come from me. But I also tried to dip into as many different sources of information relative to our last question to give some advice about things. And there was an awful lot of advice being given on absolutely everything out there right now. But to summarize, I think from our discussion today, to everyone, And in particular to our intended audience, our thinking, the thought group today as leaders is to take care of yourself. To echo my comment that it's not selfish, it's strategic. You have to build your own resilience and your own reserve. And in doing that, to be available to others, you're also setting a good example to others of how to take care of themselves. It's also managing the uncertainty. You know more than you think that you do. And I go back to that again, is it will help people to become a bit more grounded and settled in the middle of all the uncertainty. If we don't know exactly where we're going next, it's one of those rare times in leadership where we do encourage a little bit of rear view mirror thinking. How did we get to where we are? We're here because of an accumulation of past successes. What are we good at? How have we bounced back before? What new opportunities are coming at us? I've talked to a couple of organizations that we were thinking about doing this. Now we've had no choice and we did it and it's great. And I think about the possibilities there. How do we build on that? And again, communicate and connect. Is communicate with people on a regular basis. I know people are getting Zoomed to death, but I actually read an article this morning that said, please don't mute yourself on Zoom, which I know would have been a little disruptive with 119 people today. But engage with people and stay there so they can hear your comments and have a little bit more in terms of live interaction. If you're having Zoom meetings, yes, protocol and ethics and etiquette are good, but connect with people. So communicate and connect with people so that they're not feeling isolated. They know they're not alone. Sharing any little bit of information that you think might be trivial could be extremely helpful to anybody else. So that's how I would summarize things, Beth.
Those are all very practical and something that the three of them we can think of as we go forward in terms of managing uncertainty as leaders and how we tame our brain. So thank you very, very much, Fred, for your time this morning. It was a great discussion. And I also want to say thank you to Lauren Falkenberg, Janya Verhelp, Patrick Ney, Janelle Morris from the University of Calgary Executive Education for all their work, and Kathy Connolly, who all put this together to make this happen today. And I also want to say thanks so much to all of you who participated in today's session. We're hoping that you're able to join us next week, a week from today at noon. Our session there is Finding Your Place, What We Can Learn from Chinese Business, and it features Olex Olieski and Catherine Conley. So be well, and in Fred's words, take care of yourself.
Thank you, Beth.